You ever hear voices in silence? Not the crazy kind, well, maybe a little, but the kind that creeps in when the world shuts up for a second and you're left alone with yourself. That still moment where something brushes against your chest, not with hands, but with a weight you can't explain. See, people laugh at that. They call it imagination, grief, maybe even madness, but not you. No, you feel it. You've always felt it. Like someone's been watching you, not to punish you, not to scare you, but to remind you you're not forgotten. Isn't that the funny thing? We all secretly hope, even the ones who swear they don't care, that maybe, just maybe, someone out there still remembers we exist. Because when the doors shut and the lights go dim and everyone else moves on with their lives, you're left sitting in that lovely little echo chamber called your mind, wondering if all this bleeding, all this breaking, was ever seen in the first place. Oh, they said he was watching, right? That some guy upstairs with a beard and a throne is keeping tabs. But it never feels that way when you're crying into your hands, trying to stop shaking, hoping this isn't the night you finally lose it. But here's what I don't tell you. It's not about being seen when everything's shiny. It's about being seen when you're crawling, when you're limping through your own mess and still getting back up. That's when the spotlight hits you. That's when the real watchers lean in. You've been mistaken, thinking that silence meant absence, thinking the delays meant denial, but oh no, that's just how they test the ones who've been chosen without their consent. Yeah, that's the real joke, being picked for a stage you never auditioned for. You've been through some things, haven't you? Things that don't quite show on the surface. You dress up. Nice. You smile. You answer, "I'm fine," like a pro. But underneath it, there's a graveyard of battles no one claps for. You've carried grief like it was part of your anatomy. You've watched people walk away and call it timing. And you stood in the middle of storms that no one warned you about. No umbrella, no map, no. And still you kept walking. You didn't quit. And for that alone, you were never forgotten. No, you were being documented, watched, followed. See, there's a difference between forgotten and hidden. You were hidden. On purpose, pulled back while the pieces aligned in shadows. That's why things felt like they were moving for everyone else except you. That's why prayers turned into sighs. You weren't being ignored. You were being preserved. You were the prototype that couldn't be rushed. The experiment that needed just the right amount of pressure before the breakthrough. Because if they moved too soon, you would have cracked. If they spoke too early, you wouldn't have heard. So they waited. And you mistook the waiting as abandonment, but it wasn't. It was choreography. The kind that looks like chaos until you step back and see the rhythm. Every closed door wasn't punishment, it was redirection. Every no wasn't a rejection, it was a reframe. They were crafting something in you that couldn't be rushed, cracked, couldn't be skipped. Because when you're marked for something bigger, the process is cruel before it's kind. But just because you didn't get a message in the sky doesn't mean they weren't speaking. You just had to become someone who could understand the language in the ones in heaven. They don't speak like we do. They don't send texts or tweets or trending reels. They whisper through restlessness. They show up in dreams that jolt you awake at 3 a.m. They repeat faces, names, signs over and over until you either pay attention or lose your mind. They're relentless like that. And for you, oh, they've been circling your name like vultures of purpose, waiting for you to crack the code, to stop begging and start becoming. Because that's how chosen ones awaken. Not with applause, but with ache. You weren't left behind. You were left alone for a reason. Because noise distracts, comfort sedates, but silence births transformation. And in that isolation, you weren't abandoned, you were activated, trained without realizing. Every betrayal, a sharpening. Every heartbreak, a lesson in disguise. Every failure, a setup wrapped in a warning. They saw it all, and they let it happen, not because they hated you, but because they trusted what would come out of the wreckage. So don't play small now. Don't shrink and pretend like you're average. You're not. You never were. That's why life hit different for you. That's why peace felt temporary and chaos felt familiar. You weren't built for the easy route. You were built for revelation, for disruption, for a message that needed scars to deliver it properly. And someone up there? They'd been waiting for you to realize it. Waiting for you to stop looking for proof in the external and start recognizing the survival as the sign. Because the fact that you're still standing after everything means you were never, ever forgotten. The silence you felt was never absence. It was preparation. You thought the quiet was a punishment, didn't you? Thought the stillness meant you were being overlooked, discarded, left to rot in your own confusion. But that's not how it works, not for people like you. See, the ones with noise in their veins, the ones who walk around with lightning trapped under their skin. They don't get the luxury of peace until the fire's ready. And that silence you hate so much, that was the cocoon. The ugly, suffocating, God-forsaken cocoon where all your screaming turned inward and all your plans turned to dust. But it was never a void, it was a forge. You kept asking where everyone went, where the help was, where the signs were. You asked and asked until your voice cracked. And when no answer came, you assumed the worst. That no one was listening, that you were screaming into an empty sky, that maybe, just maybe, you weren't worth the reply. But let me tell you something real funny. Silence is the language of transformation. You don't bake a cake by screaming at it. You don't grow muscle by whispering to your bones. And you don't turn into something dangerous by being constantly comforted. No, you're sharpened by solitude, by discomfort, by that eerie, skin-crawling quiet that makes you face every little part of yourself without a single distraction. They were preparing you. Oh yes. Pulling back the noise so you could hear the one voice that mattered. Yours. Not the watered-down version. Not the people-pleasing echo. The raw one. The one buried under guilt and rules and expectations and fear. The one that only comes out when everything else shuts up. That's the voice they were after. That's the one they wanted you to hear. But you can't hear it in applause. You hear it when the crowd leaves and the lights go out. You hear it when you've got nothing but your own heartbeat and a room that won't answer back, and you hated it, didn't you? Hated how still everything became. How people stopped calling. How doors stopped opening. How it felt like you were stuck in some spiritual waiting room with no clock, no exit, no explanation. But what if that room wasn't a punishment? What if it was a dressing room, a war room? A place where they stripped you down just to rebuild you without the lies? Because let's be honest, you weren't ready before. You wanted the spotlight with shaky knees. You wanted the crown without the scars, and they knew it. So they shut the world out and turned the volume down until all that was left was the real you. Screaming to be born, they let you sit in the silence so long you started questioning it. Started wondering if you'd imagined the calling, the dream, the purpose. That's how they do it, you know. Strip away all the fluff until you're left staring at your own reflection. No filters, no edits, just raw reality. And in that place, that's where you found the truth. That's where the real training began. Because nothing trains a soul like silence. Nothing sharpens discernment like disappointment. And nothing builds resilience like being left with no one but yourself, and a whisper from the void. Preparation never feels like progress. That's the trick. It feels like dying. It feels like drowning in still water. But that's because the work was internal. They weren't fixing your environment, they were fortifying your foundation. They were rewiring the way you see, the way you think, the way you choose. Every delay was a detox. Every unanswered prayer was a redirection. Every closed door was insulation, not rejection. Because you weren't just being saved, you were being sculpted. And you don't sculpt with kisses. You sculpt with pressure, with silence. With heat. You were always going to be more than they thought, more than you thought. But they had to quiet the world so you could hear the strategy, the battle plan. The instructions that don't come through megaphones, they come through whispers, through gut feelings, through the kind of dreams that leave you breathless. But you can't get those messages when you're distracted by the noise of approval and attention. That's why they took it all away, not because you failed, but because you were being called into something that demanded silence before the sound. So while you were busy resenting the stillness, they were setting the stage. While you were begging for the noise to return, they were preparing the moment it would. But this time, when it does, you won't just hear it differently. You'll be different, and that changes everything. Your survival wasn't luck, it was protection. You think you just happened to make it out of that? That after all the chaos, all the knives in your back and the bombs under your bed, you just tripped and stumbled into survival like a drunk man falling into a safe house. That's cute. Really, you think the odds were in your favor? No, the odds were salivating at your destruction. They were betting against you, laughing, toasting their glasses while you cried on the floor. But something, somewhere, someone didn't let them cash in on that bet. You were shielded. Not spared, shielded. There's a difference, see, when luck walks in. It usually leaves just as quick. It's sloppy, it's random. It doesn't care about the story, but protection. That's personal. That's intentional. That's someone putting their hand over your life and saying, not yet, not like this. You were supposed to break, you were supposed to lose your mind. You were supposed to end it on one of those nights when it got too loud in your skull and too quiet in your phone. And yet, here you are, not unscarred, no, not untouched. But undeniably here, that should bother you. Not in the sad way, in the curious way. Because think how many people were stronger than you and still folded. How many had more support, more smiles, more money, and they still couldn't crawl out of their pit. And you, with your shattered self-worth and duct-tape dreams, still breathing, still functioning, still pretending you've got it together when we both know you're one wrong word away from unraveling again. That's not luck. That's evidence. Of what? Of interference, divine, calculated surgical interference. You ever notice how the worst didn't fully hit? Like it came close, right to the edge, like death and despair were circling but never really sunk their teeth all the way in. That wasn't coincidence. That was calibration. You were allowed to feel it, to taste it, so you'd know what it means to walk through fire. But you weren't allowed to die in it. Because your story wasn't written for tragedy. It just had to start there. Why? Because pretty stories don't shake people. And you were meant to shake people. So your survival had to be ugly enough to prove something. Raw enough to make liars sweat. Real enough to make others believe it's possible for them. Too, you think the attacks on your life were random. That every betrayal, every heartbreak, every night you thought you'd never get through was just a series of unfortunate events. Try this on. What if those attacks were strategic because what's inside you is dangerous to darkness? What if they knew something about you before you knew it yourself? What if the reason you were targeted so young, so often, so viciously was because you were built to disrupt things and they couldn't risk you finding that out too soon? So they tried to kill you with guilt, with shame, with fear wrapped in friendly faces, but they failed. Not because you were lucky, but because something stood between you and the finish line you thought was death. Something said they can fall, but not that far. They can cry, but not collapse. They can wander, but don't let them disappear. And so here you are with breath in your lungs and weight on your name. That's not small. That's not an accident. That's proof you were preserved. You didn't survive because you're smart, or strong, or stubborn. Though maybe you are all those things, but you survived because you were meant to. Because your survival carries data. It carries evidence. It carries weight. There are people attached to your life that you haven't met yet. People whose freedom is connected to your scars. That's why you couldn't quit. That's why they blocked the bullet, delayed the collapse, held back the full force of the breakdown. You're not just a survivor, you're a carrier of something dangerous, of something disruptive. And protection is always loudest when the battle is silent, so next time you feel like you made it out by chance, remember chance dragged you. It doesn't whisper your name while you sleep. And it doesn't make sure the knife missed your heart by an inch just so you'd wake up one more day and wonder why. No, that wasn't luck. That was a warning shot to the darkness. A reminder that you don't belong to the pit, That no matter how close it got, you weren't theirs to claim. Of course you felt unqualified. Of course you looked in the mirror and laughed at the idea of being chosen. You, the one with the mess for a past and a graveyard full of mistakes. You, the one who can't even pray without second guessing if anyone's listening. The one who still flinches when certain names pop up on the phone. Who still has nightmares in broad daylight and trust issues layered so deep even love can't reach without a map. Yeah, you were always the pick. That's the punchline they don't tell you. See, the ones who think they're qualified usually aren't. Too clean, too calculated, too careful. But the ones who know what it's like to bleed, to lose, to beg for mercy in the dark with cracked voices and trembling hands, those are the dangerous ones. Because they don't just talk, they testify. They don't just lead, they bleed when they speak. They don't need to convince anybody they're holy because they've already seen hell. And when you've seen hell, you stop trying to be impressive and start becoming effective. You know why you feel like a fraud sometimes. Because the version of you that got called isn't the version you're used to performing. They didn't choose your mask, they chose your wound. That wound you keep covering with jokes and silence and avoidance. That's where the power is, that's the access point. That's what heaven saw when you were trying to be pretty for the cameras and polite for the cameras, and they looked past all of that and said, there, that pain, that's where we'll start. And it scared you, because you thought you had to be whole to be worthy. But the truth is, the cracks are what prove you can carry something. You think you're late, think you missed it. But they waited for you, delayed certain moments, canceled certain connections, blocked certain platforms, not because you weren't enough, but because you weren't ready to believe you were. They could have launched you when you begged for it, when you were convinced success was your savior. But they didn't want you to be famous with a fake foundation. They wanted you to be free, because freedom outlives fame. And you can't free others if you're still a prisoner to your own reflection. So here's the joke, the irony, the twist in the story. The thing you've been running from, that unhealed version of you, that's the exact one they're using. Not the one you dress up for social media. Not the version that smiles through teeth clenched in anxiety. The broken one. The bitter one. The one that doesn't. Pray right, talk right, feel right. That's the one that got the assignment. Because that one's honest. That one doesn't have time to pretend. That one doesn't perform. That one's dangerous to systems built on appearance and applause, and the world's not ready for that version of you, are they? The raw one. The one that's too loud, too honest, too weird, too real. But you're not here to make them comfortable. You're here to disrupt, to interrupt cycles, to walk into rooms and shift the atmosphere just by surviving. Just by standing up and not shrinking. Just by refusing to apologize for still being here after everything they threw at you. You're not too broken. You're battle-tested. You're not too messy, you're marked. And that feeling you get, that trembling, that tightness in your chest when you think about stepping forward, that's not fear. That's recognition. Your soul waking up to the sound of purpose, calling your name with a grin. And oh, they're nervous. The systems, the patterns, the familiar dysfunctions. They're all shaking because you're not playing your part anymore. You're rewriting the script. You're flipping the board. And they don't know what to do with someone who knows their worth and still walks in limping. That limp, that's proof of the fight. That's your credential. That's your key. You were never disqualified. You were being prepared. And every no, every delay, every closed door wasn't rejection, it was insulation. It was heaven keeping you from performing for a crowd you were never meant to entertain. Because when you finally walk into the room you're meant for, you won't need applause. You won't need validation. You'll carry the kind of presence that speaks without a mic, that commands attention. Without screaming. That turns heads because it comes with scars that tell a story only survivors understand. So yeah, you're unqualified by their standards. Beautiful. That's exactly what makes you chosen. You ever notice how quiet it gets right before something big happens? Not peaceful quiet, no, that's too gentle. I mean that eerie, suffocating kind of silence. The kind that crawls under your skin and makes you wonder if you're losing it. The kind where every clock tick sounds like a scream and even your thoughts start pacing like inmates in a prison cell. Yeah, that silence. That's not nothing. That's the sound of war in the spirit. The sound of something massive trying to break through while everything familiar tries to hold it back. You feel stuck. Good. That's where pressure builds before something snaps. You're not being ignored. You're being observed, studied, watched, and not by people. Oh no, they don't even know half of what's coming. They think you're just quiet now because you've run out of things to say. They think you've calmed down, that you've settled. They don't see what's happening in the room with you, around you. In the shadows, the shifting. The unseen hands that are either protecting or preparing, sometimes both at once. You think those dreams are just dreams. That tug in your chest, that nausea when you walk into certain places. That sudden flood of tears out of nowhere, that's not drama. That's your soul reacting to a message your brain can't translate. Something's coming, and it's not small. That's why the pressure's high. That's why you've been under attack from angles that don't even make sense. You're not cursed. You're a threat. But threats get tested. You've been in a pressure cooker disguised as a season, and it's been turning up slowly. First the people left, then the peace, then the sense of time, then the motivation, until all that was left was you, raw, unfiltered, exhausted you. That version of you that doesn't sugarcoat anymore, that doesn't beg to be seen. That doesn't even explain their absence, just vanishes and reappears stronger. It had to happen like that. Because if it were comfortable, you'd still be cuddled up with your old patterns. But this time, the discomfort came with a purpose. This wasn't punishment, it was pruning. It was stripping away every illusion you built around survival. Because you don't need those illusions where you're going. You're not being elevated into a higher life just to pretend again. This next chapter doesn't have space for.